Greetings, you curious and curiouser Herle Burlyites. Thank you for being here with me week after week, and thanks too for your excellent comments on the socials about last week's pod with Dr. Jean Clinton. Again, I just want to put this out there. If you like what you're hearing on the Herle Burly, please do take a wee bit of time to hack your way through the Apple Podcast rating and review process. Those ratings and comments make a difference in some mysterious algorithmic way to who we reach with our show. All right, today on the pod we have a twofer. I'm pretty chuffed that former MPs and cabinet ministers Lisa Raitt and Anne McLellan are here. Ms. Raitt is currently Vice Chair of Global Investment Banking for CIBC, and you'll remember her well as Deputy Leader of the Conservative Party, as well as serving as Minister of Natural Resources, Labour and Transport for Prime Minister Harper. Landslide Anne McLellan is Canadian and International Strategic Planning Advisor at Bennett Jones LLP. She served in Parliament as Deputy Prime Minister under Paul Martin, as well as Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, and earlier Minister of Natural Resources, Minister of Justice, and Minister of Health. But today, they're both here in their capacities as co-chairs of the Coalition for a Better Future. Wow, what an ambitious goal, which supports nothing less than a complete rethink and reimagination of what we can achieve as a country, a raising of our sights to embrace a transformative vision for inclusive, sustainable economic growth and opportunity, particularly relevant now amidst slow to stagnating economic growth. So we're going to talk about all that today. What policy gaps are they trying to fill here? Specifically, what are they proposing, and what are the implications to a progressive policy agenda in this country? Lisa, Anne, thank you for taking the time to be with me today. How are you?
Great.
Are you?
It's wonderful to see
really?
you, David.
It's wonderful to see you, Anne McLellan. It really is. I haven't seen you for such a long time. Where do we find you both? Are you in Edmonton, Anne?
I am indeed, where I think it's minus 25 again today.
I'm snowed under in Moffat, Ontario.
Why do the Oilers suck so bad, Anne?
Hey, look, I mean, that is a question Albertans, well, I shouldn't say Albertans, Edmontonians ask themselves every year about this time. Why do the Oilers suck at this time of year? Look, I don't have the magic answer, but certainly there's a lot of frustration because, you know, during COVID, how many distractions do you have? And you can only watch so many NFL wildcard games. So, I mean, let's face it, you know, right now people would like to see a better Oilers team hit the ice. But Lisa, what about the Leafs?
Ice or goalie? Well, I'm not a Leaf fan. I'm a Canadiens fan.
No, so. I know you're a Canadiens fan.
Yeah. That's very sad. Lisa, do you have any sports things you want to talk about? The Herle Burly, a lot of sports on the Herle Burly.
Go Bills.
Go Bills. Okay.
Go Bills. Go Bills. I enjoyed, although I own jerseys for both New England and for Buffalo, I did enjoy Buffalo just shellacking the Patriots on Saturday, I guess it was. It was amazing.
Okay, guys, we should have a little wager because half my family live in Wisconsin. I was brought up as a Packers fan. I've always been a Packers fan in spite of that little Aaron Rodgers snafu around vaccinations. And obviously the Packers, this Sunday, we take on San Francisco. But, you know, who knows? Who knows who might be in our future?
Yeah. You can't judge these things, Anne. I've never really thought that Vince Lombardi and I probably shared the same politics. You know, you can't mix politics.
But you know what? Okay, Lisa, this is way off. But Vince Lombardi, truly, I was brought up in a Packers family. And we had an LP of Vince Lombardi and talking about football and things. There's actually one line, Lisa, that he said that I use. Vince Lombardi, David, said, "You always run to daylight." That's actually true in politics, too. You always run to daylight. So
well, that's a very good point.
Other than that, I'm sure I have nothing in common with Vince Lombardi.
All right, go Bills. No doubt about it.
Go Bills.
Josh Allen looking amazing. Okay, which one of you wants to start out telling me what the Coalition for a Better Future is?
Lisa,
Anne.
why don't you? Oh, okay.
Anne always goes first. She got to be Deputy Prime Minister.
Okay. The Coalition is 122 organizations of different, all across the spectrum, landscape of Canadian society. The private sector, big business, small business, the nonprofit sector, and the charitable sector. For example, the Nature Conservancy of Canada, one of the world's great conservation, nature preservation organizations, has joined the coalition. We have nonprofits who are in the business of upskilling and reskilling Canada's workforce. So 122 organizations and more are joining all the time, and we welcome new members. And what we're focused on is economic growth. Each individual organization, David, as you can imagine, each has its own challenges, its own aspirations, if you like, in terms of success. But the thing that we all agree on is that we need cleaner, greener, more inclusive economic growth. How do we get there? Because that speaks to our quality of life, our prosperity, lack thereof, or our prosperity speaks to the ability of all of us to have a good quality of life, which at the end of the day is what we all want. So we've got to focus on economic growth. To your point earlier, why has our growth stagnating? May be a harsh word, but it's used by economists, but certainly it's low. It's how do we ensure stronger economic growth? But as Carolyn Wilkins says, who is a member of our advisory council, we need the right economic growth.
Lisa, when I'm scrolling through Twitter on any given day, I'll come across tweets from the C.D. Howe Institute, from the Fraser Institute, from think tanks, from academics, from people who work at the Munk Institute. What is unique about this? What was, given all the people out there that are thinking about these issues, what's unique about this approach that you're taking?
The fact, I would say off the top, that it is decidedly nonpartisan, and having Anne and I as the co-chairs, I think is the example that we wanted to set. And as we always say to organizations, look, you're going to have your individual things that you want to lobby for, and you may want this tax credit, or you may want to have this spending program. That's great. Fill your boots. That's what you guys do. But can we agree on some big pillars? Can we agree on some really important things that we can at least spur the governments, and not just the federal government, all governments, in the direction of and having conversations about? And, you know, for me, the motivation of getting involved is I have two kids. One is 20, one is 17. They think that Canada's economic prosperity, it's a given, and it's going to continue on forever. And they're going to do better than their mom did. And they're going to be able to afford to buy a house, and their salaries are going to be higher than inflation. But I know that isn't necessarily the case, because I went through the 90s and I understand that there can be difficulties. So part of my motivation is having these organizations be able to tap into younger people, or even people sitting around, to use the old adage, sitting around the kitchen table talking about, hey, we really should worry about economic growth, and what are we doing on economic growth, and what are we going to look like in the future? So the think tanks are going to do their pieces, and they're really important because we'll get their information. But the reality is the communication has to happen, and the impetus and the energy of individuals saying to their elected politician, I really care about this, because if the constituents care about it, the MP or the MLA or the MPP is going to care about it. And that's kind of where that's why I joined up for this, is I do see this as a bit of a burning platform time.
Awesome.
And you know, David, we're not going to fight the coalition. If you look at the work we've done, it's interesting, the high degree of unanimity around the fact that good jobs, talent, really important. But what else? Dealing with inequality, dealing with inclusion in the workforce and climate change. So our coalition isn't going to sit around and argue about the importance of climate change as an existential threat. We're there. Everybody agrees. Now, a whole lot of discussion around the how we get to net zero 2050, right, Lisa?
Yeah.
But we're not arguing about that. Right? We don't care, the Fraser Institute may say what it says or someone else. Fine. We're not there. We agree on certain big things. And it is around the challenges of the future. And they are talent. They are dealing with net zero. They are having a more inclusive, just economy in which everyone sees themselves achieving. So we're not going to fight about that. Of course, there are going to be arguments about how in terms of public policy selection. But, some of the old fights, David, that's part of what's standing in the way of growing the economy. Right? And one of the biggest fights, David, you'll never get a word in edgewise here, but
don't want one. I don't want one.
And I was struck by, I listened to your Frances Donald interview over the weekend. And one of the things she talked about, Lisa, which we have heard everywhere we've gone, everyone we've talked to, let's get the three orders of government working together. We can no longer, whether it's interprovincial trade or whether it's other big structural issues for the Canadian economy, we cannot afford these fights, be they partisan or ideologically based fights in terms of our future. We actually have to try and be more sophisticated, more mature, and work together. Because otherwise, we're not going to be able to compete in this big, awfully hard world.
Yep, five minority
Lisa,
governments.
I'm older than you, but I'm older than you. So I'm going to tell you that I think the first thing that somebody said to me when I got involved in politics in Canada was, we should reduce interprovincial trade barriers.
John Manley spent his career in politics trying to reduce them.
It's interesting. I was wondering what he was doing.
The reality. And look, Lisa and I know people roll their eyes when you talk about that, but David, we are leaving billions of dollars every year on the table because of interprovincial trade barriers. And then when you layer on top of that, disputes between the government of Canada and the provinces or even big cities in terms of some of the issues facing the Canadian economy, our potential is enormous, but we are leaving tens of billions of dollars on the table. And yes, David, we've talked about it for 50 years, not you and me, but we've talked about it for a long time, 30 years. And honestly, I don't know. But I think people got a taste for what we can do during the early months of COVID if we work together and we put to one side the bickering. And I think every voter in this country should be demanding that same level of cooperation from their levels of government.
Yeah, you're so right. I happened to be doing a survey in the summer of 2020, and I asked people their confidence levels in government to do the right thing. And they were so high at that point. They're so low now. Yeah. But for a period of time, people actually were convinced that their governments were all acting in the best interest of their population. It's really interesting that you could accomplish that. So speaking of old debates, when I was working with the Department of Finance back in the 1990s, the officials there were already muttering darkly about our productivity and about growth and productivity. As a communications person, I was advising the minister never ever to mention the word productivity because people hate that word. It sounds like you want them to work more for less or something. But nonetheless, the officials were explaining to me that productivity underlines everything, that you can't have real economic growth without productivity growth. And you can't have real income growth without real productivity growth. And we have been bad at this for a very long time, have we not?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is the core underlying challenge, isn't it? I mean, you're talking about inclusive growth, you're talking about clean growth, but just growth itself is a challenge for the Canadian economy, is it not?
Lisa, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll step in here. It can't. Oh, it's not only about productivity, and that would be an example, I think, of what happens when people have different views of productivity. So if you say the problem is productivity, people assume, okay, that means less jobs for Canadians if we improve productivity because we're all going to get replaced by machines or AI, or it means that Canadian workers are lazy, and we know that they're not lazy. So the term productivity, as you know, from a communications point of view, is really fraught with difficulties. So we don't have that in our score chart. That's not something that we're necessarily measuring in terms of productivity, but we are measuring things that are important as well. And one of them is investment. One of the ones, investment in productive, tangible assets per worker. So making sure that there's investment in order to create productivity, but it's focused on the number of workers as well too. So productivity is incredibly important, but if we're going to focus on that, we're going to be leaving some people out of the conversation because they're going to think it's against them. And it's not against them at all. It's about more economic growth in general, investments that are appropriate, policy that works, and business working with nonprofit sectors. And the other thing I would say is one of the keys for trust is the fact that there's a willingness to listen to other points of view. And if you were at our conference in October, you will see that there are lots of different points of view. And big business can learn from what Goodwill was doing. And we could all learn what was appropriate from the palette skills gentlemen. And those things are really important conversations to have, and more than just conversations. I mean, just acknowledgements, recognition, and that if we all pull together, it is going to be a significant challenge, but it also is going to have a really big payoff.
So last week, I embarked on what's going to be an 8 or 9 part story here. Personally, I like a long story with lots of layers, especially when it ultimately leads to good stuff. If I want more darkness in my life, I'll just rewatch Yellowstone. It's brought to you by our presenting sponsor, TELUS. And if you remember last week's introduction, it's about how we get high-speed 5G wireless connectivity right for the whole country. Not just big urban centers, but all rural and remote areas and Indigenous communities. This is Chapter 1, the Goldilocks opportunity. 5G spectrum are the radio waves that let your cell phone and Wi-Fi transmit data. It's up to 100 times faster than what we currently rely on. And Herle Burlyites, I know you know it doesn't just come to us magically. The government auctions it off to potential carriers like TELUS. And the upcoming auction is the critical step to get high-speed wireless to everyone in all parts of this country. It's for a particular bandwidth of 5G nicknamed Goldilocks. Goldilocks because it's mid-band, not too high, not too low, just right, so that high-speed wireless signals and lots of data can travel long distances. And now you see why it's so critical for rural and Indigenous communities. As I say these words, the feds are holding public consultations on the best way to auction this Goldilocks spectrum to carriers. They want fairness for Canadians, they want service to be universal for Canadians, and they want it to spur real competition amongst carriers, so monopolies don't result and fair prices do. TELUS wants all of these things too. And next week, I'm going to tell you why the key to getting the benefits of Goldilocks to all of Canada is measured in 100 megahertz, as well as how you can have a say in the process. What's the burning platform that we're on here is what I guess I was trying to address, which is it's not the case that you are saying things are going great for the Canadian economy, but they could be better if we did the following things. You're really saying we're on a track to being a less prosperous place if we don't make some changes. Are you not?
That's my belief. I can't speak for the whole coalition, but that is my belief and that's my impetus. But I will tell you the reason why is we've had 7 elections, 5 of them have returned minority governments. And every one of those elections seems to be fighting about a singular issue that polarizes Canadians, and we're not getting anywhere. Like we're not talking about the economy. And I've lived through four of those 7 elections, and it's really fraught with difficulty when we start fighting over the hows or polarizing small little parts of a bigger issue and focusing on that only, and instead of the economy writ large.
David, I want to go back to your stock and trade, which is communication, right? And productivity. And I heard directly from someone in the government of Canada that productivity, to your point, that's not language we like, right? That's not language we're comfortable with. But what are they comfortable with? The same person said to me, and this was this person's opinion, but I think it's borne out even by, I shouldn't say even by, but people like David McKay, the president and CEO of RBC. Talent. This government cares a lot about talent. Upskilling, reskilling, getting immigration, talented people into this country, that will drive productivity, right? We have people, we have a million jobs approximately going empty right now, month over month, right? I think last month it was 850,000. That's actually a shocking number, David, when you think about it. Where are the people?
What kind of a job is that? What kind of job is that, Anne?
I think some of them are low-paying jobs in hospitality, tourism, retail. Others are actually tech and health services, right? Health, huge numbers of jobs going lacking. Nurses, other healthcare professionals, high tech. We've been talking about those vacancies long before COVID. COVID has just exacerbated the situation and made it worse. But how do you frame what actually is productivity, David? But how do you frame it in a way that's positive and that people buy into and feel comfortable with? Well, one of those areas is talent. And everybody's identified it as the number one challenge for the Canadian economy going forward. Okay? So what do we need to do? And it is, and this government and other governments in the last budget, they put a bunch of money into retraining, upskilling, reskilling, trying to get the job fit right. Also, the private sector investing in digitalization of the Canadian economy, right? This is going to be huge. It will increase productivity. Absolutely it will. And we're falling behind other nations. Investments, not only in talent, but in the infrastructure that is going to be necessary to move us to this next revolution, right? In prosperity around the digitalization of the Canadian economy. But Lisa, maybe share with David Arvind Gupta's. And if you haven't had him on, David, this, look, you know me, I tell everyone how they should run their shoes and everything. But if you haven't had Arvind Gupta on, he's a professor at U of T in the social science, arts and science faculty. He came to our conference. Lisa, tell David a little bit about the work he's doing around talent.
So he did a little pilot project, and it was shown to be such great success that my now partner at CIBC, Navdeep Bains, actually made sure that he got a larger chunk of the budget last year. And basically what he does is he recognizes where there needs to be some upskilling, and he finds those people in the hospitality kind of entertainment fields, and he gives them the skills, and it's not a lot of skills that they necessarily need. And then they go on to get jobs in the areas that Anne was talking about, like high tech. And the example he gave at this conference was compelling. He talked about a female bartender who he gave some skills. She had all the soft skills. He just gave some skills in terms of presentation, maybe a little bit about putting together a resume, and did a 6-week or 8-week program. She walks out, gets a job in sales in a tech company, and is beating all of the other guys in sales right now. And the reason being, as a bartender, what does she do? She listens to people. She already had that sales ability, but she's been able now to turn it from a minimum wage job, relying upon tips, to a salary with bonus. I love that story. And it's a real life example of why skilling up is important, but you got to make connections with folks out there.
So we need to
try to bring this down to earth for me. Every government talks about skills training. Every government talks about putting in place programs to reskill people. I can't remember how many times we talked about that in our budgets, and things like that about fights between jurisdictions about who should have responsibility for training. I remember in the 90s that was a big deal.
Yeah.
Was province is going to be in charge of training or the federal government in charge of training. So this is not a new idea that this guy has. Why are governments failing at doing it?
Why have years and years of training programs failed? They need to be measured. Like, do we know that they're failing or do we not know? That's the problem, right? We never have that measurement at the end to determine whether or not this program is working. Governments are fantastic about setting up programs, but does it actually work? And who's doing the measurement of whether or not it works? And that's why the scorecard, which will be an annual review of certain aspects of prosperity, and then we can measure, did this, not necessarily this program work, but is it working in general? And, you know, I think we've worked really hard on trying to make sure that the measurements that we're going to be put in place are ones that are recognized by OECD, that can be measurable, and that are going to reflect upon the items that the coalition said were really important.
But David,
great, because I want to challenge you right away.
But it does come back. But it does come back to the fact that we were talking about this earlier. It's about people being willing to give up control, right? And figure out who you need to work with, right, Lisa? So upskilling, reskilling, training. First of all, what do you need to know? You need to talk to the private sector about where they see the jobs of the future, right? What are they going to need to be able to grow and to invest and hire more people? And then provinces and the federal government need to stop bickering over, you know, which department at which order of government gets to control the program and the dollars. And it has to be a much more consensus-driven, data-driven initiative, right? And, you know, I think, again, how long have we been talking about this? A long time. But just as we hit a debt wall in 94, 95 and had to deal with it, we are going to hit a talent wall. We are going to hit that wall and we won't have the right people in the right places to drive economic growth. So again, it's about people parking their historic biases, understanding how crucial the challenges are, and getting on with it. And maybe it's maybe the private sector steps up and says, you know, we've had enough of this. We've had enough of the bickering and the partisan whatever. And you know what? This is too important to all of us and our quality of life. You guys, you know, over there, bicker away. But we are actually going to tell you what we think we need to succeed. And you're either our partners, you're either part of the solution, or you're a big part of the problem, governments.
Yep.
Okay, but wait a second. Wait a second, Ann. You can't bullshit a bullshitter, okay? So I have... Here's something you probably didn't know. The coldest capital city in the world is Ulaanbaatar. Not Ottawa, Ulaanbaatar. But overall, Canada's winter still beats Mongolia's. And this is the coldest month. Some parts of the country are flipping between whiteout blizzards and cold so profound it'll damage your face if you're not careful. It's the season of indoor living. But not for our sponsor, CN. Its trains must keep rolling across the prairies and past Great Lakes and over mountains, and they must roll on time. If they're disrupted, so is the economy. And you know, we already have enough problems in that department. So CN meets Canada's winter head on and deals with it. It's a big job. Severe cold plays nasty games with the physics of steel rolling on steel, especially under thousands of tons of pressure. It makes welded tracks less flexible, and ice crystals effectively attack train wheels, wearing down tread. Deep cold is also the enemy of air brake systems, on which trains rely to slow their massive inertia. Frozen gaskets leak and hoses fail, and if they aren't detected quickly, breakdowns and delays pile up. The solution is rigorous diligence and investment in technology. In winter, CN intensifies examinations of wheels and tracks. Gaskets are constantly changed. Thousands of winter-prepped locomotives capable of increased traction are deployed. Trains are inspected by track sensors and by automated portals as they roll through. Snow melters keep switches and critical junctions clear. CN's scientists strive to provide ultra-accurate weather updates, and automated warning devices ratchet up surveillance of high water levels, avalanches, and landslides. When temperatures drop to severe levels, trains are shortened, which improves braking. There's a lot more to it, but you get the picture. CN's dedicated railroaders can't do anything about the problems overseas that have been choking global supply chains, but they can and do ensure smooth, efficient, rock-solid dependability of the domestic rail shipments we all depend on. As a matter of fact, CN carried record levels of cargo last winter. That didn't happen by accident. I have heard an awful lot of people say that the real problem with our economic growth and our economy is not government policies, but a business community that is lazy and unambitious, doesn't innovate, and doesn't invest, sitting on dead money, won't do anything with it. Don Drummond, whom you know and you respect, told me, I don't know what more government can do to get business to invest.
I don't disagree.
But they're at the table now because they're seeing that there's a cliff in the future that will not guarantee prosperity in Canada. So they're at the table and they're sharing the table with not-for-profits, and they are involved in this coalition, and they recognize that there is an issue and they want to work with the governments. And to your point, you know, where do we have these kinds of, where are the governments all going to talk to each other? You all know that we have these FPT tables, federal, provincial, territorial tables for each separate ministerial. And that's where these conversations can happen with bringing in the business and just open the doors up and figure out, make sure that the mandate for one of these FPT committees is that they're looking at skills, for example, or they're looking at clean tech and bring in the other people who can give deputations on it instead of it all getting lost in Royal Commission after report after advisory committee.
David, look, you're right. That investment. Here I am echoing my colleague at Bennett Jones now, David Dodge, but obviously someone we all know well. David Dodge would say investment at big challenge for the Canadian economy, right? And you're right that the private sector has to invest more, and government, I mean, when you think about rebuilding public infrastructure in this country to get us to net zero, that's not all private sector money. Some of it will be, but the government, I mean, those who compare it in a little way, in some ways, to building the Trans-Canada Highway or building, CN or CP, a national railway across the country, that's what we need in national infrastructure like a grid, a new or rebuilt electricity grid across this country.
We haven't done anything like that as a country for 70 years.
I know, but maybe net zero, maybe the existential threat of climate change playing out in front of us month after month in places like British Columbia or here in Alberta with the Fort McMurray fires or drought. Maybe, in fact, that drives us to understand that absolutely we need new investment for those big national projects, but we also need investment from each individual company to build out, to get bigger, retrain their people. Absolutely. Those people who say the private sector is not investing enough, that's part of our scorecard, David.
Exactly.
Absolutely. They're not investing enough. They're not doing enough R&D in comparison to their competitors in other parts of the world. Absolutely. And so this isn't just about government. This, to Lisa's point, this is about actually getting all the key players, including nonprofit sector of our economy, together and saying, okay, it may not be a crisis like 95, But we are slow walking to that cliff Lisa mentioned with the rest of the world unless we start to be honest with each other.
Okay, Lisa, I'm going to direct this question to you because I know what a neoliberal warrior Anne McLellan was in the 1990s. I wouldn't put this question to her. But,
I think I've just been insulted, Lisa.
I don't know. He's using $10 words I don't understand.
There's a lot of business people like Larry Fink in the United States, like recently in the last few days, Michael McCain and Frank Stronach in Canada, who are of the view that capitalism as it is currently structured, and all these people are capitalists, that capitalism as it is structured is failing and will not survive without serious reform. I know that's 30,000 feet up from where you're working, but what are your thoughts on that?
I would say that some of the work that the coalition has done in focusing on better standards of living and ensuring that there's inclusion in this new economy speaks to that it's not just about a return to the shareholder, that it is going to be about improvement of people's lives in general. And as Anne pointed out, the business community has signed on to this, and that's something that is being valued and is important to it. Now, it cuts both ways. I mean, quite frankly, if we talk about needing to have more people in the labor market and we want to have more diversity of thought, of course, we're going to have to make sure that we're being inclusive so that we're using all parts of our society to their fullest extent. And there's going to have to be an investment there. But I think if straight capitalism is just about caring about the bottom line only, you've seen all the companies pivot away from that. That happened 20 years ago. It's CSR, the triple E bottom line. All those kinds of terminologies have been around for a long time. And if you look at any of the business leaders in the country, including of all the banks, what they do care about is their team. They care about their customers. They are always doing reviews on how their customers feel about them, what's important to their customers. And I think that if their vision of capitalism is solely focused on how much money you're making for the shareholder, then I would agree that that kind of roaring 80s greed is good Wall Street analysis is over, and we have really morphed into a different world. Bottom line is still important, and you need it, and you have to reward the people who invest in these companies through taking shares. But that being said, there are bigger pictures that they are concerned about, and I'm glad it's a big part of our scorecard, quite frankly, and companies will be measured by it.
And have you reconsidered your previously heartless positions?
Oh my gosh.
I don't know what happened here. Hey, I'm a bleeding heart liberal.
How are you the right of me? That doesn't make any sense.
Because I know her.
David would probably say that, yes, I am a heartless capitalist. But no, look, Lisa and I were both born and brought up in Nova Scotia, right? We can't be heartless capitalists. Now, Lisa generally points out, David, that she was born in Cape Breton and I'm a mainlander, but hey.
That's okay.
But look, I think Lisa's absolutely right. Capitalism, as we've known it, it's not going to work any longer. And when you look at the emphasis now put on purpose, right? The purpose of the corporation, which is well beyond shareholders now, and this large stakeholder capitalism, right? Not shareholder capitalism. I guess Milton Friedman may be spinning in his grave, although I think he even had a conversion on the road to heaven toward the end of his life around that issue. So, yeah, ESG. What is the thing, Lisa, that we hear all the time?
Everywhere. Yeah.
And it's ESG. And what is embedded, among other things, in the E? Climate change. What is embedded in the S? Talent, the health and safety and training of your workers. And then, of course, the G, among other things, good governance in terms of that corporation or a nonprofit or private company, whatever it is, good governance. So that, in fact, I read Michael McCain's interview, and I actually had the opportunity to hear him. He was part of a consultation we did for something that ICD and TMX are doing
very
together
on these issues.
And he's been talking about this for quite some time, the importance of purpose-driven companies and how from the bottom up with your employees, you develop that purpose and you develop your strategic plan. Yeah, absolutely. That is the future. And I think the companies who are embracing that will succeed. And if they don't embrace it, Larry Fink, with his $10 trillion to invest in the global economy, will make sure those companies are paying a price for not paying attention, right?
Right. Something in your scorecard, and talk about your scorecard if you want to, because I know that you both wanted to have it with you today. So it's obviously an important part of this. When I read it, there was just something that jumped out at me, and it's a personal bugaboo of mine, which is you had right at the very top of your list of things was living standards and increasing living standards for working people, right? And the proof point underneath that was a growing GDP, a growing economy. And I'm not of the view that if it ever did, it does now, that a growing GDP naturally finds its way into working people's pockets.
It doesn't naturally find its way.
No, what we've seen in recent decades is that the top percent of earners and wealth is scooping up a disproportionate share of economic growth as we go along. So when you talk about improving things for the ordinary person, what else is involved just besides growing the top line of the economy?
Well, in the scorecard, we measure to make sure that the living standards are spread equally out amongst the economy and the workers in general. So one of the measures is the average poverty gap, which I think is a really good way of figuring out, as you grow the economy, how is that being impacted? And then the one that I like as well is the income parity across genders, races, and peoples with disabilities. And I think that speaks to the whole inclusion piece, and to be measured against that is extremely important, because it gives the ability of business and of not-for-profits and government to stop and say, wait a second, okay, we may be growing because we've got better investment in R&D from private corporations, but it's not getting spread appropriately. So what's the policy fix, and how do we figure this piece out? Because we all agree that we want living standards to go up for everybody in all of these specific, I guess, smaller slices of society.
And look, there are
things we need to do,
barriers.
like increase the strength of labor unions, or what do we need to do to get more of the money flowing to labor as opposed to investment?
Look, we know there are systemic barriers, right? When Lisa refers to one of our metrics, income parity across gender, race, and people with disabilities. How long have we been talking about the fact that there are systemic barriers to those individuals, those groups of individuals, achieving, being able to come into the workforce and work to their full capacity, right? And that's part of what we're talking about around talent. Why did we have Goodwill come to our economic summit? Why did we have Community Foundations of Canada come to our economic summit? Because we know that, and it's the right thing to do to reduce those barriers to full inclusion in the Canadian economy and more broadly society. But it's also a smart thing to do. People can be self-interested and still do the right thing, right? And the right thing here, which will also enhance productivity and labor force involvement, is actually being honest about the barriers we come to. I was blown away by the president of Canadian Goodwill, right? And I had to gut check myself. What are the stereotypes I have about physical disability and what I think the potential or the capacity is of someone with a certain disability. Well, boy, you need to think about, when you listen to someone like the president of goodwill is, oh my gosh, look at the productive capacity. We are losing. And
yes.
we are not including these people in a way so they feel that they are part of a shared enterprise. And here I'm not talking about the company, I'm talking about society, right? That they have the dignity of work and being able to prove their capacity, and we all benefit. But there are still way too many barriers. And yes, we've broken a lot of them down and we're doing a lot better than we have, but we've still got a long way to go. Now, is that going to deal with your big macro issue of the 0.01 of the 1%, having made out like bandits during COVID? No. But I think to Lisa's earlier point, and our scorecard speaks to it, there are things that must and can and must be done to try and level up.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And it really is, the scorecard's about naming and shaming. To be honest, if you're not pulling it, we're gonna talk about it. Who is not pulling their part? And woe betide the Canadian public when they find out. And I mean, unfortunately, that's the stick. And sometimes the stick does work.
We're going to start canceling people in business. Excellent. Or government, wherever they are. They're not doing the right thing. You're going to get canceled on social media.
I feel my future prospects going down the toilet as you say that, but nonetheless.
So excuse a relatively long preamble to this question, but I want to have a full discussion of it. And I think that having worked with you all this period, that you and I have probably traveled a similar road on climate change, from some skepticism in the early 90s to true believer status today.
Yeah.
And that's where I'm at. So I'm not starting this from any, do we really need to do it? It's existential to the species, as far as I'm concerned. So certainly to civilization as we know it. So, but I want us to have a real conversation in Canada about it. And I don't think we're having a real conversation in Canada about it.
I agree.
And it's because the advocates are afraid to acknowledge any of the downsides associated for fear of undercutting support for action on climate change. But you have integrated into your thing is clean growth. So that's right at the top of your objective.
Yeah.
So let me put a proposition to you, and you both have so much more expertise than I do. I just know enough to be an agent provocateur. So is it really possible for Canada to reduce its emissions the way the government has been increasingly adding to its target level? We're now up at, I think, 45% reduction.
Between 40 and 45.
As our target level. Can we really do that and become more prosperous at the same time? Or for Canada specifically, is there not a clear and direct trade-off between our prosperity and reducing GHG emissions?
Lisa, you want to go first?
I'm going to say that there is currently, and I agree with you completely, David, that we do need to have a larger conversation, but there is a fundamental disconnect, I think, in the country. And it is the fact that we agree that we want to go to net zero, but we also agree, I hope, or understand that we really don't have a way to get there yet. And that the assumption is tech is going to step into the middle of it all. And that's going to be the great leveler. I believe that will happen. I believe that, I mean, we've been doing CCUS for 30 years now, and we know that that's going to be a way forward for some of our larger emitters here in the country. I do believe that we can have prosperity and still reduce our net zero emissions, but tech is going to have to play a really big part of it. And we're going to have to make sure that we're helping them invest in it. The question is how fast. I think that the time limiting reagent in all of this is how fast a government pushes on this happening. If you push too fast, people are going to get hurt and they are going to feel the pain and they're going to throw that government out. And that's I think the balancing point for me is that you have to show progress, but it can't be one that isn't achievable given the tools that you currently have in order to reduce the emissions. I'll give you a quick example. Years ago, when I was Minister of Transport, the United States, through the EPA, decided that they didn't want to have ballast water exchange on vessels coming in through the St. Lawrence Seaway because it created, we ended up having alien invaders through vessels and all that kind of stuff. So they made the decision, but there was no tech to do that. There's no tech to clean the ballast water. There's no agreeable tech that the Coast Guard could sign off on. So it ended up in lawsuits back and forth across the border. And we really didn't go anywhere because they made the pronouncement, yet we couldn't get to that point. That's what I'd like to see avoided in Canada, that we make the pronouncement, but that we have the investment in tech. And if it's right and we do it well, I look to the United States. Biden's going all in. $70 billion they're pouring into this prospect that clean tech is going to be their next revolution, and that's how they're going to ensure that they beat the other countries in the world for prosperity. Well, they're onto something. And if they believe it, then I believe it. And we have to really double down and make sure that we get to that point. So that's my long-winded answer to your, I thought, really thoughtful question.
We do have
and you're sitting there in Edmonton.
Yeah.
And there's no better illustration of the fact that this country's prosperity to this point has been founded on two facts. One, we have a geography that was rich in natural resources that could be extracted and exploited. And B, we sat right next to a market that wanted to buy them. And so this is what's made us rich. We lose those two things. I'm not saying we're dumb people. We'll invent things. We'll have businesses. We'll do things. But are we going to be as rich? Really?
Well, look, I can't answer that question, but I don't know why we assume we're going to lose those two things. I mean, nobody, including the government of Canada, I don't know how many times the Prime Minister has to say it in terms of oil and gas. He's not talking about production cuts. He's talking about emissions cuts, right? And to Lisa's point, what's going to drive those emissions cuts? Tech, new technologies. So the oil sands, the big five, who aren't waiting for even government, right? They know the writing's on the wall.
Can I interrupt you? I believe Jonathan Wilkinson told me on this podcast.
Yeah.
That at a certain point, probably 2050, we're not producing any more oil and gas.
Oh, I think now I have great respect for Jonathan Wilkinson. I think in 2050, we are still going to be producing oil and gas, but it will be at least scopes 1 and 2 emission free. Yeah. Scope 3, that's you and me and Lisa buying our gas that comes out of the oil sands originally. That's a different issue and one that has to be dealt with. But I think we will still be producing oil and gas, but it's going to look different. It will be done differently. But I do agree with Jonathan, between now and 2050, we will see a reduction in demand. And that means that the world will be producing less oil and gas, right? Interestingly, the world's going to be producing more natural gas over the next 20 years because it's going to be a substitution fuel for coal and for oil, right? Yeah. So, but it is, there are too many people out there and in my province who want to scare people and say, oh my gosh, by 2035, the oil sands are going to be shut down. Well, no, nobody's saying that. Nobody in this government, which is more climate friendly than anyone we've seen, is saying that. And we will still have fossil fuels in 2050, and we will still be producing them. But it will look so different. People will be amazed at what human ingenuity has been able to deliver. But we're in a transition. And nobody knows at this point what all the pieces of that will be. We know some of the pieces today. It's a carbon tax, it's carbon capture and storage, it's blue and green hydrogen, it's maybe hopefully getting that new national electricity grid built. It's small modular reactors in terms of the energy space, right? And that's where the focus is in terms of climate change. It's on the energy space. We all need energy to fuel and propel everything we do. Electric vehicles. David, if we get it right, and here, and Lisa and I have talked about this. Lisa, you should talk about critical minerals. You think we're not going to be a resource powerhouse? You better believe we are.
Absolutely.
Because we are one of the top 2-3 countries in the world in terms of the cobalt, copper, lithium, and other critical minerals that are going to drive the electric vehicle revolution. But again, we're going to extract them differently. I was on the board of Cameco, a uranium mine, up until May of this year, turned out. What are we doing? We're digitizing our mines. We don't want to put people underground anymore, but we're going to retrain them so that they know how to, from the surface, which is safer and healthier for everybody, extract uranium, bring it to surface, process it, and so on. So we are still going to be a natural resource powerhouse, but we are going to be doing things differently, and the needs will be different.
Yeah, and natural gas is going to be the most important piece of it, especially when you think about the conversion to hydrogen for the heavy industries that's going to be needed for trucking, for bigger modes of transportation. I mean, that's going to be extremely important going forward. So the great role in Canada for natural gas.
You've got two former natural resource ministers here.
Yeah, the sky's the limit. This is we really are ring of fire. We're in a great position, If we can focus on economic growth and a long-term plan that works for everybody.
Okay, here's how fucked up this country is, Lisa. Here's how fucked up this country is, okay?
Okay.
In 2014, in the 2014 Ontario election, Kathleen Wynne's government basically made one promise to the North. We'll build a road to the Ring of Fire. We'll spend $1 billion and build a road to the Ring of Fire. To my knowledge, that road is still not built 7.5 years later. A road.
Right.
How are we going to, these things don't work here.
Well, part of the coalition's work is going to have to be about talking about what the blocks are, the building blocks to prosperity, and just communicate it and give the politicians that, give them the balls to make the decisions that they need to make, right? That's what it comes down to. And that it's important to do consultation. It's extremely important to make sure. And in fact, we do have the Aboriginal Business Council as part of our membership, because we really have to make sure that we're doing this appropriately, but it can be done. And there are people who want to invest in it. And Ring of Fire, if we don't do it, someone else is going to come in and build the road privately themselves and own all the resources, because that's happening around the world.
See, Lisa raises an important issue we haven't touched on here. For us to continue to be a natural resource engine for the Canadian economy, the exploitation of those resources is going to have to be done differently. And yes, tech, I've raised that issue, but it's going to be dependent upon, in many cases, most cases, meaningful consultation and involvement with Indigenous Canadians. And the Ring of Fire got off to a bad start, David, right? And we know even 7 years on that consultations, the Supreme Court has told us, not in detail, governments have taken on the fact that consultations are not going into a community, having a meeting, and then leaving, right?
Yeah, exactly.
People tried that 30, 40 years ago. That didn't work so well. So we now have a framework, imperfect as it is, for appropriate, meaningful Indigenous consultation. And I will say this, very little is going to get built in this country going forward without meaningful Indigenous participation.
Equity. There has to be,
Exactly. Where they see a win for them and their communities. And we have not done that very well. And that is going to be part of driving economic growth in the future. And we had 2 or 3 amazing, Alicia Dubois and a couple of others at the Economic Summit talking about how things are changing, not quickly enough, but but how things are changing, how Indigenous peoples themselves are capitalizing some of these big projects for their communities. There's a lot of work that has to be done, but I think the private sector and provincial and federal governments at all levels, understand that this is one of those big structural pieces that has to change. Otherwise, a lot of things are either not going to happen or it's going to take a lot longer than it needs to.
Yep, and look at the success stories already. I mean, we've got the Mi'kmaq owning 50% of Clearwater on the East Coast. The
Big story.
I'm sorry for saying it incorrectly, but Six Nations Oneida in Ontario with NR working on the largest battery storage place in Canada right now. There's some really big wins happening across the country. And I think
for sure.
We do have a lot of things going in the right direction here, and Ring of Fire should be the next one on the list.
Yeah, and Paul is so excited about that Clearwater thing.
It's amazing.
And it is amazing. It totally is.
Chief Terry did a great job.
Yeah. And on the West Coast, some of the communities, Indigenous communities out there who are figuring out that TMX may not be such a bad thing, or that natural gas going through the port of Prince Rupert or somewhere else may not be such a bad thing if it's done right, and if there are true partnerships with sustainable economic growth for Indigenous communities, and if there's respect for the land, and all of that. I think a lot of good things can happen for everybody, but it's not easy. This is not an easy country, David. Lisa, you, me, we know that, right? We know it's not an easy country, but that
why are you telling me who's more spectacularly failed to figure it out than me?
The Conservative Party of Canada, maybe.
So this is a political show. This is a political show, and you can't expect to get away without a political question. When you two formed this thing, I said to myself, okay, so this is a reaction to the leftward drift of the Liberal Party and to the drift of the Conservative Party toward populism. And these two centrists are trying to drag the economic debate back to the center. Am I wrong to say that?
No, you're dead right. You're dead right.
You got it. We found a space where we can agree. And there's a lot more conservatives and liberals out there who agree that that is the space we should be operating in, or it's a safe space.
Yeah.
So what's next for this organization? What's up? You've got a big day today, right? You're meeting with MPs today?
At their request.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So tell me where all this goes.
Well, I guess it's my turn. Where are we going? Well, first of all, we can tell you that right now that we are going to have another conference next year. It's going to be in October, and we're going to strive to do exactly the same thing. It's going to be about making sure that people listen to one another, and everyone who wants to have a voice will have a voice. We'll continue to work with the Advisory Council, which is incredibly impressive, and help guide what the coalition is doing. We're going to continue to sign up members. We went from 105 to 122 since the conference, and we're going to mark people on. Well, we're going to come out with a baseline and an analysis on the scorecard, and that's what's going to be really important and a really good talking point for folks to understand how well Canada is or isn't doing. And I think that's going to be enough for the year. That's a lot to chew on.
And look, all our members, the budget's coming, right? The budget. So, I mean, we represent a wide diversity of organizations and interests, and they'll all do their pre-budget letters and consults. David, you're
not
well
expecting
aware.
The budget to say anything about economic growth, are you?
Well, our goal, the speech from the throne talked about economic growth. We saw that as a small victory. Yeah. The budget is coming, the economic update, right? Chrystia Freeland talked a little bit about the importance of long-term economic growth. And we're talking about, obviously, longer-term sustainable economic growth, right? We're not talking about 6 months from now when we're still fighting our way through COVID. But then we've got the budget coming. So sure, as the coalition, we want focus on long-term sustainable economic growth. The details of that, yes, our coalition, they'll be making their individual submissions. I'm even willing to admit some of them might be, in disagreement with each other.
Right.
But that's fine. That's up to them. What we want is the Minister of Finance to acknowledge the importance of economic growth and the fact that there are some big pieces we're going to have to move on and get right, working together with others to have this cleaner, greener, more inclusive economy that ensures a high quality of life for Canadians. Now, I do want to mention, we take ideas and work from everywhere, right, Lisa? We're like sponges, and we put it on our coalition website and other places. So as members of the coalition, we have the PPF, the Public Policy Forum. We have Canada 2020. We have IRPP, which in the interest of full disclosure, I chair the board on, right? These are high quality think tanks, right? Doing good work. And Lisa and I participated in the PPF 5 growth summits that they held virtually this year across the country. There's tremendous work and thought, people coming together and parking their individual interests, perhaps, and talking about the larger challenges that we all face as a nation and as communities and even as families, right? We act as this sponge in a way for a lot of work that's being done by others, and those organizations will in turn bring together others. We're asking them and others to focus, do a podcast on one of these metrics and do a deep dive. And, think about how we keep the focus, or how we ensure that the big city mayors, the provinces, and the right people in the government of Canada. And Lisa and I are meeting with a variety of elected officials at different levels to make the point that economic growth, this is what you've got to focus on. If you want to do all these other things, if you want $10 daycare, then where does the revenue come from? Revenue on David only, where does it come from? It comes from taxes or going out as governments, I guess, like the private sector, into the markets and selling treasury bills, right? So there's only, unless you've got economic growth, you're not going to have the revenue to drive all the good things we want.
Well, it's been a couple of years of magical thinking on that, so it's good to have work like yours to yank us back to reality. I want to end this because we've out of time. We could go on for a long time. It's so interesting to me. I want to end with 2 thoughts. One of which, Lisa, you don't know me, but the two of you, if you want some pro bono comms help, give Alex and I a call, and it'd be great.
Oh, good, great,
thank you,
and help you. The second thing is, I just want to thank you so much. I mean, Anne, it's always a joy to talk to you about policy, and it's been too long.
I'm not sure he means that sincerely, Lisa.
I do mean it. I do mean it. I love Anne McLellan. Like, I could just grab her and hug her right now. That's how much I love Anne McLellan. And Lisa, I've been a fan of yours your whole career, and I know you're going through a lot of shit, so thank you for making the time.
Appreciate it. With us. That's good.
I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail, and all of you Herle Burlyites for listening today, and we'll be back next week. Take care of yourselves.
Herle Burly, Herle Burly.